They laughed when the homeless Navy SEAL got $1, but his dog uncovered a secret worth $50 million that changed everything. Snow fell hard over Jackson Hole as Ethan Cole stepped into a room full of wealth that wasn't his. Boots worn, eyes steady, and his German Shepherd Shadow at his side, he listened as millions were handed out, until his name came. $1. Quiet laughter followed. But Shadow was already watching the room, like something didn't add up. Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell me where you're watching from. The snow came down in thick, steady sheets over Jackson Hole, swallowing sound and softening everything it touched. By the time Ethan Cole stepped out of his old pickup truck, the world had narrowed to white and silence, broken only by the low hum of distant traffic and the crunch of his boots on packed ice. He paused beside the truck for a moment, one hand resting on the door, his breath drifting in slow clouds in front of him. The building rose above him, glass and steel, 40 stories of polished wealth reflecting a sky that looked colder than the ground beneath it. The kind of place where decisions were made behind closed doors, where men in tailored suits moved money like pieces on a board. Not a place for a man like him. Shadow stepped down from the passenger side with quiet precision, landing lightly despite his size. The German Shepherd shook once, snow scattering from his thick coat, then moved immediately to Ethan's side. His ears were forward, eyes alert, reading the environment in a way no human ever could. Ethan didn't look down at him. He didn't need to. "Stay close," he said quietly. Shadow was already there. Inside, the warmth hit them first, dry, artificial, carrying the faint scent of leather and polished wood. The lobby floor gleamed beneath recessed lighting, reflecting the soft movement of people who seemed to glide more than walk. Conversations were low, controlled. Everything here was measured. Heads turned. Not dramatically, not openly, but enough. A man in a worn coat, snow still clinging to his shoulders, boots that had seen too many winters, and beside him a working dog that didn't belong in a place like this, not in their world. Ethan walked straight through it, posture steady, pace even. He had walked through worse rooms than this, rooms where silence meant something very different, rooms where the wrong movement could end a life. This was just another kind of battlefield. The elevator ride was quiet. A woman stepped in on the 12th floor, glanced at Shadow, then at Ethan, and shifted subtly to the far corner. Shadow didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, calm, grounded, his presence filling the space without asking permission. When the doors opened on the 42nd floor, the atmosphere changed again. The hallway was softer, carpet underfoot, muted lighting, doors closed tight against whatever business was being conducted behind them. At the far end, a set of double doors stood open. Voices drifted out. Ethan walked toward them. Inside, the room was already full. A long table stretched across the center, surrounded by people who looked like they belonged there. Expensive coats draped over chairs, watches that caught the light, faces composed in that particular way of people expecting good news. At the head of the table stood a man in his early 60s, gray hair, glasses, a file folder open in front of him. Caleb Mercer, estate attorney, the one who had called Ethan 3 days ago. The conversation in the room softened as Ethan entered, then stopped. Not completely, not obviously, but enough. Eyes moved to him, then to Shadow, then back to him again. Ethan didn't acknowledge any of it. He took the empty chair closest to the door and sat down without a word. Shadow settled immediately at his feet, body angled slightly outward, watching the room with calm, unblinking focus. Across the table, a man in a dark suit leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest. Victor Bennett. Arthur Bennett's son. Victor studied Ethan the way a man studies something he's already decided doesn't matter. "Well," Victor said, just loud enough for the room to hear. "Didn't expect you to show." A few quiet smiles flickered around the table. Ethan didn't respond. Caleb cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he glanced briefly toward Ethan, then back to the document in front of him. "Shall we begin?" No one objected. The reading started with formality. Names, properties, accounts, the language of inheritance, precise and emotionless, carrying weight without ever acknowledging it. Victor received controlling interest in the company. Several others were granted properties, investment portfolios, assets that stretched into numbers most people never saw in their lifetimes. There were nods, small shifts in posture, the quiet satisfaction of expectations being met. Ethan sat still. He hadn't come expecting anything. Arthur had never promised him anything. What had existed between them wasn't built on that kind of exchange. Shadow's breathing was slow, steady against his boot. The reading continued. Minutes passed. Then Caleb turned a page. "There is one additional bequest." The air in the room shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. A subtle tightening. Attention refocused. Caleb's voice remained even. "To Ethan Cole." Victor's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled. Caleb reached into the folder and withdrew something small. He placed it carefully on the table and slid it forward. It moved across the polished surface with a soft, deliberate sound. Stopped directly in front of Ethan. A single dollar bill. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a quiet sound broke through the silence, something between a chuckle and a breath forced through the nose. Victor leaned forward slightly, his expression amused. Guess the old man had a sense of humor after all. A few more reactions followed, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. Laughter held just enough to remain polite. Ethan looked down at the bill. George Washington stared back up at him, unchanged by the room, by the people in it, by the weight of what had just happened. $1, 2 years. He didn't move. The laughter faded, not because it was over, but because it wasn't being fed. The room seemed to wait, watching him, measuring what he would do with what he'd been given, or what had been taken from him. Shadow lifted his head slightly, eyes shifting from the bill to Ethan's face. Ethan reached forward. His fingers closed around the edge of the bill. He picked it up, folded it once, clean, precise, and slipped it into the pocket of his jacket. Then he stood. The chair moved softly against the carpet. Shadow rose with him in the same instant, silent, controlled. Ethan looked around the room, not at Victor, not at any one person, but at the room itself, taking it in, memorizing it maybe, or letting it go. Victor's voice followed him as he turned toward the door. "Hey," he said, tone light. "Try not to spend it all in one place." This time, the laughter came a little easier. Ethan didn't stop. The hallway outside felt colder, even with the heat still running through the vents. The elevator arrived almost immediately, doors sliding open as if the building itself was eager to move him along. Inside, the silence returned. Real silence. Not the kind filled with expectation or judgment, just space. Shadow pressed lightly against Ethan's leg as the doors closed. The two of them reflected faintly in the polished metal walls. 42 floors down, neither of them moved. Outside, the storm had thickened. Snow covered the street in a fresh layer, muting the city, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. Ethan stepped out into it, the cold biting at his face, grounding him in a way the warmth upstairs never could. He stood there for a moment, hand in his pocket, the folded dollar pressed between his fingers. He thought about Arthur, about the long drives, the quiet evenings, the things that had been said, and the things that hadn't. There were things Arthur had done carefully, deliberately, even at the end. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Come on," he said. Shadow was already moving. They crossed the street together, disappearing into the falling snow, the glass tower rising behind them like it had never mattered at all. But the dollar in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. And for the first time since he'd walked into that room, Ethan wasn't entirely sure why. The truck door creaked as he pulled it open, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm. Snow had already begun to gather along the edges of the windshield again, thin at first, then thickening by the second. Jackson Hole disappeared behind a veil of white as he climbed into the driver's seat. Shadow jumped in beside him without being asked, settling into place with practiced ease. His ears flicked once, catching something outside, then relaxed. His attention shifted back to Ethan. Ethan sat there for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. He didn't start the engine right away. The folded dollar was still in his pocket. He could feel it. Not heavy, not physically, but present, like something unfinished. The engine turned over with a low, steady rumble. Heat pushed slowly through the vents, carrying the faint smell of old pine and dust. Ethan pulled out into the road, tires crunching over ice, the city lights fading behind him as he drove toward the mountains. The further he went, the quieter it became. Buildings gave way to open land, then to forest, then to nothing but road and trees and snow that seemed to fall harder the deeper he drove. Shadow watched the landscape pass by the window, head slightly tilted, eyes tracking movement Ethan couldn't see. The road curved along a ridge, then dipped into a narrow valley where the trees closed in tighter, branches heavy with snow. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, just enough to move forward. Ethan drove one-handed, the other resting near his jacket pocket. He didn't pull the dollar out. Didn't need to. He already knew what it looked like. What he didn't understand was why. Arthur Bennett wasn't careless. Not with money, not with people, not with time. Especially not in the last year. The memory came back without warning. A narrow two-lane road. Snow falling, just like this. The old truck Arthur insisted on driving himself, even when his hands had started to shake. "You don't trust anyone else?" Ethan had asked him once, watching the man struggle slightly with the wheel. Arthur had smiled, faint but steady. "I trust people just fine," he said. "I just prefer to know who I'm trusting." Ethan had nodded, not pushing further. That was how most of their conversations went. Simple on the surface, deeper if you listened. The cabin came into view through the trees, a dim shape at the end of a narrow dirt road. The porch light was still on, casting a small circle of yellow against the snow. Ethan pulled up and cut the engine. Silence settled in immediately. The kind of silence that only existed far away from everything else. He stepped out into the cold, boots sinking slightly into fresh snow. Shadow followed, landing softly, then pausing just long enough to scan the tree line before moving toward the door. Inside, the cabin was exactly as he had left it. Small, clean, functional. A wood stove in the corner, a table by the window, a bed along the far wall. Nothing extra. Nothing unnecessary. Ethan moved to the stove and added a log, crouching down to coax the fire back to life. The flames caught slowly, then began to grow, pushing warmth into the room. Shadow circled once on the rug and lay down, his body angled toward the door, eyes still alert. Ethan sat in the chair beside the stove, elbows resting on his knees. For a while he just listened. The fire cracking, the wind pressing against the walls, the quiet breathing of the dog at his feet. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. The dollar bill came out folded exactly the way he had left it. He turned it over in his fingers. The edges were worn, soft, like it had been passed through too many hands to count. Arthur hadn't been a man for gestures without purpose. Every decision he made had weight, even the small ones, especially the small ones. Ethan leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the fire. Another memory surfaced. The ranch. Late fall, the fence line had been broken along the eastern edge, the posts leaning where the ground had softened after rain. Ethan had noticed it without being told. He'd fixed it the next morning. Arthur had come out to watch, leaning against the truck, hands in his coat pockets. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Ethan kept working. "Yeah," he replied. "I did." Arthur had studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Most people don't see things unless they're told to. Ethan shrugged. Most people aren't looking. Arthur smiled at that. Not wide, but real. Later that same day, Shadow had wandered out into the field, nose low to the ground, tracking something only he understood. Arthur had watched him for a long time. "Good dog," he said eventually. Shadow had returned at the sound of his voice, stopping just short of him, waiting. Arthur reached down, his movements slower than they used to be, and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Best one in the room," he added quietly. Ethan hadn't corrected him. Back in the cabin, the fire burned stronger now, casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan rubbed a hand across his face, exhaling slowly. 2 years. Driving. Fixing things. Sitting in silence. Listening when there was nothing to say. He hadn't done it for money. Hadn't expected anything in return. That wasn't the kind of arrangement they had, which made the dollar wrong or incomplete. Shadow shifted on the rug, lifting his head slightly. His eyes moved to Ethan, watching him with that steady, knowing look he always had when something wasn't right. Ethan met his gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Doesn't add up." Shadow didn't move, didn't need to. The bond between them wasn't built on commands anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was built on understanding. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with a sudden, sharp gust. The sound echoed through the cabin, followed by a low roll of thunder somewhere deep in the mountains. Ethan's body reacted before his mind did. His shoulders tensed. His breathing shifted, faster, shallower. The sound didn't stay in the mountains. Not in his head. It was closer, louder, different. Another crack of thunder followed, sharper this time. For a split second, the cabin wasn't a cabin. It was something else. Dust in the air, heat, pressure. Distance measured in seconds between flash and impact. Ethan's hand pressed flat against the table without realizing it. Shadow moved instantly. He crossed the room in 2 steps and pressed his body against Ethan's leg, solid and warm, not forceful, not frantic, just there. Ethan closed his eyes. focused on the weight of the dog against him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his coat under his hand. Ground. Here, now. The thunder rolled again, but further away this time. The tension in Ethan's chest eased, slowly unwinding. He exhaled. "I'm good," he said under his breath. Shadow stayed where he was for another moment, then settled back down, though his eyes remained on Ethan a little longer than usual. The storm moved on. Inside, the cabin returned to what it was. Just a room. Just a fire. Just a man and his dog. Ethan picked up the dollar again. This time he looked at it differently. Not as money, not as a joke, but as something placed in his hand on purpose. Arthur had known something, planned something, and whatever it was, it hadn't ended in that room. Ethan folded the bill once more, slower this time, more deliberate. He slipped it back into his pocket. Then he leaned back in the chair, eyes on the fire, the storm fading outside. For the first time since he'd left the law office, the question wasn't what he'd been given. It was what he hadn't been told. And why? Shadow's ears twitched slightly, picking up something in the distance Ethan couldn't hear yet. The dog didn't move, but he was listening, waiting. Shadow's ears shifted again, small, precise adjustments, picking up something far beyond the range of human hearing. His body didn't tense, didn't rise. He stayed still. That was what made Ethan notice. If it had been a threat, Shadow would have moved. Instead, he listened. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind that deep, frozen quiet that settled over the mountains just before dawn. No wind, no movement, just the kind of silence that carried sound farther than it should. At first, Ethan heard nothing. Then, faint, the crunch of tires on snow. Slow, careful. Not someone lost, someone who knew exactly where they were going. Ethan stood without a word. His body moved automatically, years of training taking over without conscious thought. He crossed to the window and brushed aside the frost along the glass with the back of his hand. Headlights appeared through the trees, low beams, controlled, cutting through the dark in steady lines. The vehicle rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, engine idling quietly. A large black SUV, clean, out of place. Ethan watched. Shadow rose to his feet beside him, silent, his posture alert but not aggressive. His tail stayed low, his weight balanced evenly across all four legs. Reading. The engine shut off. The door opened. A man stepped out into the cold. Long coat, dark, hat pulled low against the early morning air. He closed the door with care, not letting it slam, then stood for a moment as if adjusting to the silence. Ethan recognized him before the man reached the porch. Caleb Mercer. Ethan opened the door before the lawyer could knock. The cold rushed in, sharp and immediate. "You're up early," Ethan said. Caleb removed his hat, holding it at his side. His breath formed small clouds in the air as he stepped onto the porch. "I didn't sleep," he replied. Shadow stepped forward slightly, placing himself just off Ethan's left side, not blocking, not threatening. Present. Caleb's eyes flicked to the dog for half a second, taking in the posture, the stillness, the control, then back to Ethan. "I'm sorry for the hour," he said, "but this couldn't wait." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossing over his chest. "Didn't figure you for a social visit?" A faint, almost humorless smile touched Caleb's face. I'm not. The silence between them held for a moment, the cold settling in around them, the world still half asleep. Then Caleb spoke. "The dollar you received yesterday," he said carefully, "it wasn't what it looked like." Ethan didn't answer. Caleb met his eyes. It wasn't an insult. Ethan's gaze didn't change. What was it then? Caleb exhaled slowly, as if measuring how much to say and how quickly to say it. It was the key. The words hung in the air between them. Ethan didn't move. Shadow's ears shifted again. Ethan stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside." Caleb nodded once and crossed the threshold. Inside, the cabin felt smaller with another person in it. The fire had burned low, casting a warm glow across the room. Caleb removed his gloves and set them on the table, placing his hat beside them with deliberate care. He didn't sit right away. He looked around instead, taking in the space. Minimal, functional, clean. "You've kept things simple," he said. Ethan shrugged. "Less to worry about." Caleb nodded as if that confirmed something for him, then took the chair across from Ethan. Shadow moved closer to the table, settling down where he could see both men at once. Watching. Ethan remained standing for a moment, then sat opposite Caleb, the wooden chair creaking slightly under his weight. "Start talking," Ethan said. Caleb folded his hands together on the table. "In Montana law," he began, his voice steady, professional, leaving someone even a nominal inheritance, something as small as a single dollar, establishes them as a named beneficiary of the estate. Ethan listened without interrupting. "A named beneficiary," Caleb continued, "cannot be easily removed from the will. It prevents challenges that would otherwise exclude them entirely." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "So he made sure I stayed in." "Yes." "For what?" Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He laid it on the table and slid it forward. Ethan didn't touch it right away. He looked at Caleb first. "You could have said all this yesterday." Caleb's expression tightened, just slightly. "I couldn't." "Why not?" "Because there were people in that room who weren't meant to hear it." Ethan held his gaze for a moment longer, then reached for the paper. He unfolded it slowly. A map. Topographic lines. Elevation markers. A narrow road that ended abruptly before reaching a series of hand-drawn circles along a ridge. Red ink. Precise. Deliberate. Ethan leaned forward, studying it. "What is this land?" Caleb said. 83 acres. Privately purchased 6 years ago through a holding company. No public record connects it to Arthur Bennett. Ethan's eyes moved across the map. Forest, elevation. No structures marked. No access roads beyond a certain point. Why hide it? Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Ethan take in the details. "Because of Victor," he said finally. Ethan looked up. Caleb met his gaze. Arthur believed his son would contest anything of real value in the estate. He structured things to prevent that. Ethan leaned back slightly. "And this land isn't part of the estate." "No," Caleb said. "Not officially." "Then why am I looking at it?" Caleb's voice dropped, quieter now. "Because it belongs to you." The words landed heavier than anything that had been said so far. Ethan stared at him. "For $1. "For the right reasons," Caleb replied. Silence settled again. Shadow shifted slightly, his attention moving between them, reading tone, posture, tension. Ethan looked back down at the map, His eyes followed the ridge line, the circles, the lack of detail. Something about it didn't feel random. Nothing Arthur had done had ever been random. "There's something out there," Ethan said. Caleb nodded once. "Yes." "What?" Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair. "I don't know," he said. "Not exactly." Ethan's eyes lifted sharply. "You brought me a map to something you don't understand?" Caleb didn't flinch. "I brought you a map to something Arthur wanted you to find." That stopped Ethan. Not the words, the certainty behind them. Caleb continued. "He made it very clear, before he died, that if anything happened, if the will was executed, you were to be given access to that property. No one else." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "He could have just told me." Caleb's expression shifted. He believed certain things had to happen in a specific order. Ethan let out a quiet breath. "Yeah," he said. "Sounds like him." Shadow stood. Both men looked at him. The dog had moved to the door, his head tilted slightly, ears forward again. Listening. Not to them. To something outside. Ethan followed his gaze. "Someone else coming?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "No. Just the morning." Ethan stood slowly, stepping toward the door. He opened it again, letting the cold air spill into the room. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the first gray hint of dawn breaking over the mountains. The snow had stopped, leaving the world still and untouched. Shadow stepped out onto the porch, nose lifting into the air. He took a few steps forward, then stopped. His body stilled completely. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Ethan watched him closely. "You've been there," he said quietly. Shadow didn't look back. Didn't move. But something in his posture changed. A certainty. Ethan turned to Caleb. "When do we leave?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "Now." Ethan nodded once. He went back inside, grabbing his jacket, pulling it on over the same clothes he'd worn the day before. No packing. No hesitation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded $1. He looked at it for a second, then slipped it back inside. Shadow was already at the truck, waiting. His body was still, but not relaxed. His head was slightly lowered, nose working the cold air, pulling in information that hadn't yet reached Ethan. When Ethan approached, Shadow shifted his weight forward just enough to signal readiness. Not curiosity. Direction. Ethan opened the driver's door and slid in behind the wheel. Caleb took the passenger seat without a word, placing the folded map carefully on his lap. Shadow climbed into the back, settling immediately, but keeping his eyes forward, locked on something only he seemed to understand. The engine turned over, breaking the silence. "Which way?" Ethan asked. Caleb unfolded the map again, glancing between it and the narrow road ahead. "North for about 20 miles, he said. "Then we leave pavement." Ethan nodded once and pulled onto the road. The early morning light crept slowly across the mountains, gray at first, then pale blue along the ridgelines. Snow covered everything, fields, fences, rooftops, flattening the landscape into something almost unreal. The world felt paused, like it was holding its breath. They drove without conversation. The town disappeared behind them quickly, replaced by long stretches of open land, and then, gradually, dense forest. Pine trees lined both sides of the road, their branches heavy with snow, bending slightly under the weight. Inside the truck, the heat built slowly. Caleb kept his eyes on the map, occasionally checking the road signs, though they became fewer and farther between the deeper they went. Ethan drove with the steady focus of someone used to navigating terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. In the back seat, Shadow shifted once. Not restlessness. Adjustment. His head moved slightly to the left, then back forward again. His ears made small, precise movements, tracking something distant. Ethan noticed. "You've brought him out there before," he said, eyes still on the road. Caleb didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally. "Arthur insisted on it." Ethan glanced at him briefly. "How many times?" "3, maybe 4. "And you never asked why?" Caleb gave a small, tight smile. "I learned a long time ago that when Arthur Bennett told you something wasn't your concern, it was better to believe him." Ethan let that sit. It matched what he knew. The road narrowed. The pavement ended. Gravel took over, crunching under the tires, the sound louder now that the world around them had gone quiet. Snow covered most of it, leaving only faint tracks where someone might have passed days ago. "Or weeks. Keep going," Caleb said, tracing a line on the map. "There should be a turn coming up." Ethan slowed slightly, scanning ahead. There was no sign, no marker, just trees. Then Shadow let out a low, controlled breath. Not a sound. A signal. Ethan saw it a second later. A break in the trees, barely wide enough for a vehicle. The entrance to a narrow path almost completely hidden by snow. He turned the wheel without hesitation. The truck pushed through, branches brushing along the sides with a dry, scraping sound. The path wound deeper into the forest, climbing gradually as it went. The trees grew thicker here, the light dimmer, the air colder. No tracks, no signs of use. "This hasn't been touched in a while," Ethan said. Caleb nodded. It was meant that way. The climb steepened. The engine worked harder now, the tires gripping uneven ground beneath the snow. The path curved around a ridge, then dipped slightly before opening up. The trees parted. A clearing revealed itself slowly, like something emerging from memory. 2 acres, maybe more. Flat ground surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The mountains rose behind it, their peaks still buried in early light. At the center stood what used to be a ranch. The house leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Windows were broken or boarded. The wood had faded to a dull gray, worn by weather and time. To the right, a barn stood in better condition, still upright, though the boards were warped and darkened. A collapsed fence ran along the far edge of the clearing, half buried in snow. Everything was still. No wind. No sound. Just the quiet weight of a place that had been left behind. Ethan killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Shadow jumped down from the truck. He landed softly, barely disturbing the snow, and immediately lowered his nose to the ground. Not searching. Following. Ethan stepped out, the cold cutting through his jacket instantly. He scanned the clearing out of instinct, taking in angles, distances, lines of sight. No movement, no threats, just silence. Caleb joined him, his boots sinking deeper into the snow than Ethan's. "This is it," he said quietly. Ethan didn't respond. His attention was on Shadow. The dog moved across the clearing in a straight line, his pace steady, unhurried. He didn't wander, didn't double back. He knew where he was going. Ethan followed. Each step felt heavier than it should have, the snow resisting just enough to slow him down. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, sharp and clean. Shadow reached the barn and stopped at the doors. Two large wooden panels, weathered and cracked, hung slightly uneven on rusted hinges. A narrow gap ran between them, dark and still. Shadow pressed his nose to the base of the doors, moved it slowly from left to right, then stopped. He stepped back once, looked at Ethan, and began to dig. Snow sprayed backward in short bursts as his paws worked fast and precise, not frantic, controlled. Ethan crouched beside him, brushing snow aside with his gloved hands. The ground beneath was hard, frozen, but Shadow kept going. Then a sound, flat, metallic. Ethan froze. Shadow stopped instantly, sitting back as if to confirm what he'd found. Ethan cleared more snow. His fingers hit steel. A flat surface set flush into the ground, edges barely visible beneath the frost. He brushed along the perimeter, revealing a seam, a clean cut, deliberate, not natural. A hatch. He looked up at Caleb. The lawyer stood a few steps back, watching, his expression unreadable. "I told you," Caleb said quietly. "Arthur wanted you to find this." Ethan turned back to the metal plate. There was a handle set into one side, barely visible under a thin layer of ice. He wrapped his hand around it. Cold bit through the glove immediately. He pulled. Nothing. He adjusted his stance, planting his feet more firmly, putting his weight into it. The metal groaned. Frost cracked along the edges. Then, slowly, it moved. The seal broke with a dull, hollow sound, like something that hadn't been opened in a long time finally giving way. The hatch lifted. A rush of cold air rose from below, dry, stale, untouched. Ethan held it open. Darkness stared back up at him. Then, one by one, lights flickered on below, dim at first, then steady. A ladder descended into the earth, disappearing into a space that shouldn't have been there. Concrete walls, steel beams, something built, something hidden. Shadow stepped closer to the edge, peering down, nose working the air. No fear, no hesitation. Recognition. Ethan looked at him, then back at Caleb. "What exactly did he build out here?" Ethan asked. Caleb shook his head slowly. "I don't think," he said. "You've seen the half of it yet." Ethan gripped the edge of the hatch, staring down into the lit darkness beneath the barn. The world above was quiet, still, untouched. But below, something had been waiting. For a long time. And now, it was open. The cold air rising from the hatch was different from the air above. Drier. Still. It carried a faint metallic scent, like something sealed away from time. Ethan held the steel lid with one hand, staring down into the space below. The ladder dropped straight into the earth, anchored to reinforced concrete. The lights had stabilized now, casting a muted yellow glow across the walls beneath. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't storage. This was deliberate. Shadow stepped forward, placing his front paws at the edge of the opening. He leaned in, nose lowered, drawing in the air from below. His ears moved once, then settled. No threat. Something else. Familiar. Ethan released the hatch slowly, letting it rest against its hinge, then shifted his grip to the ladder. "I'll go first," he said. Caleb nodded, stepping aside. Ethan placed one boot on the top rung and began to descend. The metal was solid beneath his weight. No rust giving way. No looseness. Whoever built this had built it to last. Each step down pulled him further from the open sky, the cold mountain air replaced by something heavier, enclosed. The light grew stronger as he descended, revealing more of the structure below. Concrete walls, steel supports, clean lines. When his boots touched the floor, he paused. The space stretched out wider than he expected, at least 40 feet across, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. Shelving lined both sides, stocked with sealed containers, equipment, supplies arranged with careful precision. A low hum came from somewhere deeper inside. Power. Ethan stepped off the ladder, turning slowly, taking everything in. Shadow was already coming down behind him, moving carefully but confidently, placing each paw with measured control. When he reached the floor, he shook once, then stood still, scanning the space. Reading. Caleb followed last, slower, gripping each rung as he descended. When he reached the bottom, he took a moment to steady himself before stepping aside. "I've never been down here," he admitted quietly. Ethan believed him. "This wasn't just hidden," Ethan said, his voice low. "It was built to operate." He moved deeper into the bunker. Shelves were stocked with water containers, medical kits, sealed crates labeled in neat, handwritten script, dates, inventory codes, everything cataloged. Someone had been here. Recently. Not years ago. Not abandoned. Maintained. Ethan ran a hand along one of the metal shelves. No dust. No decay. "This wasn't for survival," he said. "Not like people think." Caleb watched him. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked around again, more carefully this time. "The layout," he said. "The organization. This isn't someone hiding from the world." He turned slightly, eyes narrowing. "This is someone preparing for something." Shadow moved ahead of them, crossing the space toward the far wall. His pace was steady, purposeful. He wasn't exploring. He was following a path he already knew. Ethan followed him. At the far end of the bunker, a heavy steel door stood set into the concrete. It was thicker than the rest of the structure, reinforced, with a mechanical lock at its center. Different from everything else. More secure. Shadow stopped in front of it. He lowered his nose to the base, tracing the seam slowly, then lifted his head and looked back at Ethan. Waiting. Ethan stepped up beside him. "This is what he wanted found," he said. Caleb approached, reaching into his coat. "I think so," he replied. He pulled out a small brass key, old-fashioned. Simple. Ethan looked at it. "No electronic lock?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. Arthur didn't trust systems that could be accessed remotely. That sounded like him. Ethan took the key. It was warm from being inside Caleb's coat, light in his hand, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with metal. He stepped closer to the door. The lock was stiff, unused, but not neglected. He inserted the key and turned it slowly. Resistance. Then movement. The mechanism shifted with a deep mechanical click, followed by a second, heavier release. Ethan pulled the handle. The door opened inward slowly, the hinges resisting just enough to remind him of the weight behind it. The room beyond was smaller, more contained. The walls here weren't just concrete. They were carved into the rock itself, reinforced but raw in places, the natural stone visible beneath the structure. The air was colder. Still, in the center of the room stood a large safe. Military-grade, thick steel, heavy locking wheel at the front, built to withstand more than curiosity. Beside it, a wooden desk, old, solid, out of place in a room like this. And on that desk, an envelope. Ethan stepped inside. Shadow moved with him, staying close but alert, his eyes moving across the room, taking in every detail. The envelope sat in the center of the desk, untouched. Ethan approached it slowly. His name was written across the front. Ethan Cole. The handwriting was unmistakable. Arthur's. Caleb remained near the doorway, giving him space. Ethan picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, heavier than standard stock. The seal at the back was intact, pressed with a signet mark Ethan had seen before, on a ring Arthur wore every day. This wasn't rushed. This wasn't improvised. This had been planned. Ethan turned the envelope over in his hands. For a moment, he didn't open it. Instead, he looked around the room again. The safe. The walls. The silence. Everything about this place pointed to something larger than a simple inheritance. Something structured, layered, hidden on purpose. Shadow moved away from him slightly. Ethan noticed. The dog had shifted toward the center of the room, nose low again, tracking something across the floor. He stopped. Right in the middle. Then he tapped the ground once with his paw. Ethan's attention snapped to him. "What is it?" he asked. Shadow tapped again. The sound was different this time. Not solid. Not quite. Ethan stepped closer, crouching down where Shadow stood. He brushed his hand across the concrete floor. At first, it felt smooth. Then, a seam. Thin. Precise. Barely visible unless you were looking for it. Ethan traced it with his fingers. A rectangle. Cut clean into the surface. Not a crack, not damage. A compartment. He looked up at Caleb. "You knew about this?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "No." Ethan sat back on his heels. His eyes moved between the hidden compartment, the safe and the envelope in his hand. 3 things. 3 layers. Arthur hadn't just left him money. He'd left him a sequence. Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog stood still, watching him, calm and certain, like he already knew what came next. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then he turned back to the envelope. "This comes first," he said. He broke the seal. The paper inside unfolded with a soft, deliberate sound. Ethan's eyes moved to the first line. He read it once, then again. His jaw tightened slightly. The room seemed to narrow around him, the weight of the words pressing inward. Behind him, Shadow didn't move. Caleb didn't speak. Ethan kept reading. And with each line, the meaning of the dollar in his pocket shifted. Not smaller, not larger. Clearer. Arthur hadn't left him behind. He had chosen him, and whatever was buried in this room was only the beginning. Ethan stood still in the center of the vault room, the letter open in his hands, the edges of the paper steady despite everything shifting inside him. The first paragraph wasn't emotional. It wasn't sentimental. It was specific. Arthur hadn't written about feelings. He had written about actions. The winter morning, Ethan drove him through a blizzard without being asked. The fence he repaired before anyone noticed it was broken. The night they sat on the porch when the doctor called, and Ethan said nothing, just stayed. Line by line, Arthur laid it out plainly. You did not stay for money. You did not stay for obligation. You stayed because you chose to. Ethan's eyes moved slower now. He could hear Arthur's voice in the words, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, certain. Then the letter changed. No transition. No warning. Victor. The name appeared alone on the page before anything else followed. Ethan's jaw tightened. Arthur wrote about his son the same way he had written about everything else, without emotion, without judgment, just facts. Over the past 5 years, Victor Bennett had been systematically draining the family company, not recklessly, not carelessly, carefully. Money moved in small amounts, spread across multiple accounts, routed through companies that didn't exist beyond paper, contracts signed with businesses that had no employees, no operations, no purpose other than to receive and redirect funds. Layer after layer. Invisible unless you knew where to look. Arthur had known. Not at first. But once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Ethan lowered the letter slightly, his eyes lifting toward the safe for a moment before returning to the page. Arthur continued. He had hired investigators, quietly, paid them through accounts Victor couldn't trace. For over a year, they followed the money, documenting everything they could reach. It wasn't enough. Victor had built the system too well. There were gaps, missing links, pieces that couldn't be proven without something more. Ethan read on. Arthur had known his time was limited. The diagnosis had confirmed it. He didn't have years. He had months. So he changed strategy. Instead of exposing Victor directly, he began preparing something else. A contingency. Ethan's grip on the letter tightened slightly. Arthur had liquidated personal assets over 5 years, not all at once, not in ways that would draw attention. Piece by piece. The total came together slowly. $50 million, held in a protected trust. Separate from the estate. Untouchable. Invisible. Ethan's breathing slowed. His eyes scanned the next lines. The trust had one condition. It could only be activated by its named beneficiary. Ethan Cole. He didn't react outwardly. But something shifted inside him. Not surprise. Recognition. Arthur had been building this for a long time, long before the illness, long before the final months. He had already chosen. Ethan looked up briefly, meeting Caleb's eyes across the room. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ethan returned to the letter. The condition was clear. To access the trust, Ethan had to expose Victor's operation before a specific event. Arthur named it precisely. An investment deal scheduled to finalize within days. A partnership that would move the stolen money into legitimate structures, burying it beyond recovery. Once that happened, everything Victor had done would become almost impossible to trace. If Ethan succeeded, the trust would be released. The company would survive. The people working under it would keep their jobs. If he failed, the trust would dissolve. All evidence would be turned over to federal investigators. The company would collapse under investigation. Thousands would lose everything. Arthur had written it without emphasis. No dramatics, just outcome. Ethan reached the final paragraph. The handwriting changed slightly. Slower, heavier, as if each word had cost more than the last. I do not want revenge. Ethan read it twice. I want the company to survive. I want the people who built it to keep what they earned. A pause. I believe you can do both. Ethan exhaled slowly. The last line followed. I cannot do it from where I am going. That part belongs to you. The room went quiet. Not because it had been loud before, but because something had settled. Ethan lowered the letter. For a moment, he didn't move. Shadow remained where he was, lying near the center of the room, his head up, watching Ethan with steady focus. His breathing was calm, controlled, as if he had already accepted what this meant. Caleb stepped forward slightly. "You understand now," he said. Ethan didn't look at him. "Yeah," he replied quietly. Caleb waited. Ethan folded the letter once, then again, careful with the edges. "50 million, Ethan said, and he leaves me $1 in front of that room." Caleb's voice stayed even. "He needed to make sure you were inside the will." Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "He needed to make sure no one saw what he was actually doing." That landed. Caleb didn't argue. Ethan stepped toward the desk and set the letter down beside the envelope. His eyes moved to the safe, then to the floor. The hidden compartment. "Everything connects," he said. Caleb nodded. It always did. Ethan crouched beside the seam Shadow had found earlier. He pressed his fingers along the edge again, searching for a release. "There's more," he said. "There always is," Caleb replied. Ethan found it, a slight indentation along one corner. He pressed. The panel shifted inward with a soft click, revealing a cavity beneath. Inside sat a sealed case, black, reinforced, designed to protect whatever was inside from moisture, impact, time. Ethan lifted it out. It had weight. Not excessive, but enough. He set it on the desk and opened the clasps. Inside, a USB drive, wrapped carefully, labeled in Arthur's handwriting. 2019 to 2024, beneath it, a stack of handwritten notes, dates, numbers, observations, Arthur's own records, separate from everything else. Ethan picked up the drive, turning it over in his hand. 5 years of documentation. 5 years of watching his own son dismantle everything he had built, without saying a word, without showing it. Waiting. Planning. Ethan set the drive back into the case. He looked at Caleb. "How much time do we have?" Caleb's expression hardened slightly. "Not much." Ethan nodded once. He looked down at Shadow. The dog met his eyes immediately. No hesitation, no doubt. Ethan reached down, placing a hand on the side of his neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his fur. "One more job," Ethan said quietly. Shadow's tail moved once, slow, certain. The bunker hummed softly around them. Above them, the mountains stood silent. But below, a plan that had taken 5 years to build had just been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The bunker felt smaller now, not because its walls had changed, but because everything inside it had a purpose. Ethan stood at the central table, the USB drive plugged into a rugged laptop Caleb had retrieved from a locked cabinet along the far wall. The screen glowed cold in the dim light, lines of data scrolling in quiet, relentless motion. Shadow lay beside the table, head up, eyes tracking Ethan's movements. His body was still, conserving energy, but there was no rest in him. Not tonight. Caleb stood on the opposite side, sleeves rolled back, reading through printed pages pulled from Arthur's case file. "Victor didn't just build a shell network," he said. "He built layers of protection around it. Each company feeds into another. If you pull one thread, it disappears before you can trace it." Ethan didn't look up. "Then we don't pull threads," he said. "We find where it all comes together." Caleb nodded slightly. "That would be the physical inventory," he said. "The place where the numbers turn into something real." Ethan's eyes shifted to the map pinned against the wall. Northern Idaho. A logging yard. Isolated. Private. Warehouse, Ethan said. Caleb followed his gaze. Yes. Ethan stepped away from the table, moving toward a cabinet near the wall. Inside, neatly stored equipment, flashlights, radios, cold weather gear. Arthur hadn't just prepared information. He had prepared access. Ethan pulled out a compact flashlight and clipped it to his belt, then a radio, testing its weight before attaching it to his jacket. Caleb watched him. "You've done this before," he said. Ethan didn't answer directly. "Different place," he replied. "Different war." He turned toward Shadow. The dog was already on his feet. "Ready." Ethan crouched briefly, checking the harness, running his hand along Shadow's side, feeling muscle, tension, readiness. "You stay tight," Ethan said quietly. Shadow's ears flicked once. Understood. The drive north took 2 hours. Night settled fully over the mountains, the sky clearing just enough for a thin line of stars to break through. The road stretched long and empty, winding through forest and ridge, the truck's headlights cutting a narrow path through the dark. No music. No conversation, just the steady hum of the engine and the quiet rhythm of controlled breathing. They stopped a mile short of the location. Ethan cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. He stepped out first. The air was colder here, sharper. The scent of pine was stronger, mixed with something else, fresh-cut wood. Industry. Shadow jumped down beside him, landing silently, already working the air with his nose. Caleb remained by the truck, watching. "This is as far as I go," he said. Ethan nodded. "Keep the engine warm," he replied. Caleb didn't argue. Ethan moved into the tree line. Shadow followed without needing direction. The forest swallowed them quickly, branches overhead blocking what little light remained. Snow crunched softly under Ethan's boots, each step measured, controlled. Ahead, through the trees, light. Artificial. Harsh. Ethan slowed, dropping lower as he approached the edge of the clearing. The warehouse came into view. Large, industrial. Metal siding reflecting floodlights mounted along the perimeter. A fence surrounded the property, chain link topped with wire. One vehicle parked near the main gate, 2 figures moving along the perimeter. Guards. Ethan watched for a full minute. Counting steps. Patterns. Timing. Shadow remained still beside him, body low, eyes fixed ahead. 2 on rotation, Ethan whispered. Vehicle at the gate. Shadow's ears adjusted slightly. Ethan moved along the tree line, circling toward the rear of the property. The fence line dipped slightly where the ground had shifted over time. A small gap had formed at the base. Enough. Ethan dropped flat, pushing through carefully, the cold metal brushing against his jacket. Shadow slid through after him with ease. Inside. No alarms. No reaction. Ethan stayed low, moving between stacks of cut timber arranged in long rows. The smell was stronger now, fresh pine, resin sharp in the air. The warehouse door ahead stood partially open. Light spilled out onto the snow. Voices inside. Ethan paused, listening. 2 men. Talking. Unaware. He moved closer, pressing himself against the side wall. He leaned just enough to see inside. Crates stacked in rows. Shipping labels. Clipboards hanging from hooks. Shadow shifted beside him. Then, still, completely. Ethan felt it immediately. Something had changed. He glanced down. Shadow's body had locked. Not alert. Not cautious. Immediate. Ethan turned his head slightly. Footsteps. Close. Too close. He dropped lower instantly, pulling back into the shadow of the stacked timber. Shadow pressed flat beside him, body aligned, minimizing space. The beam of a flashlight cut across the snow. A guard. Closer than expected. "Thought I heard something," the man said. Another voice answered from inside. "Wind. Place creaks all night." The flashlight moved. Slow. Scanning. It passed within feet of where Ethan lay. Paused. Then moved on. Ethan didn't breathe. Shadow didn't move. Seconds stretched. Then the light shifted away. The guard turned back toward the warehouse. Ethan waited. 3 seconds. 5. Then he moved. Fast. Inside the warehouse. Shadow at his side. The air was warmer here, filled with the smell of wood and oil. The two men stood near a desk, backs partially turned. Ethan moved between the rows of crates, staying low, using the stacks as cover. He reached the first set of labels. Company names. Codes. He snapped a quick photo with the small camera clipped to his vest. Moved to the next. More names. Different ones. Shell companies. Matching what he had seen on the drive. Proof. Real. Connected. He moved deeper. Shadow stayed close. Then, the dog froze again. Harder this time. Ethan felt it before he heard it. Footsteps. Closer. Behind them. He turned. The beam of a flashlight snapped across the row. "Hey!" The shout broke the silence. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Go," he said. He moved fast, pushing toward the exit, Shadow beside him. The second guard shouted, boots hitting the concrete floor hard. Then, a loud crack. The sound tore through the warehouse, echoing off metal and wood. Not aimed, but close, too close. Shadow made a sharp, involuntary sound. A yelp, short, cut off. Ethan felt it like a physical impact. He didn't stop. They burst through the door into the cold night, snow exploding under their feet as they ran. "Move!" Ethan shouted. Shadow kept pace, but something had changed. A slight hitch in his stride. Left side, barely visible. But there, Ethan saw it, registered it, stored it, no time. The fence. He dropped, pulling it up just enough. Shadow slid through. Ethan followed. They hit the tree line seconds later, disappearing into the dark. Behind them, voices rose. More lights. More movement. But too late. They were already gone. Back at the truck, Caleb had the engine running. Ethan opened the rear door. Shadow jumped in. Ethan climbed in after him, slamming the door shut. "Go," he said. The truck accelerated immediately, tires gripping the frozen road as they pulled away. Inside, Ethan's hands moved fast. He ran them along Shadow's side. Found it. Warm. Wet, blood. Not deep, but real. Shadow turned his head slightly, eyes on Ethan. Calm. Still working. Ethan pressed his hand against the wound, steady, controlled. "You're okay," he said quietly. "You're good." The truck sped through the dark, the warehouse shrinking behind them. The mission had worked. They had the proof. But the cost. Ethan kept his hand pressed against Shadow's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The plan had moved forward. But now, It had become personal. The truck tore through the mountain road, headlights cutting through the darkness in sharp, steady lines. Snow sprayed from beneath the tires as Caleb pushed the vehicle harder than he had on the way in. Inside, the air was tight. Not loud, not chaotic. Just controlled urgency. Ethan sat in the back seat with Shadow, one hand pressed firmly against the dog's shoulder, the other working through the medical kit Caleb had thrown over without a word. "Keep it steady," Ethan said. "I am," Caleb replied, eyes locked on the road. Shadow didn't resist. He didn't whine, didn't pull away. He lay still, breathing faster than normal but controlled, his head turned slightly toward Ethan, watching him. Trust. Absolute. Ethan cut away a small section of fur around the wound, exposing the graze beneath. Blood had soaked into the coat, but the damage wasn't deep. A clean line. Close. Too close. "You're lucky," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the dog. Shadow's ears flicked slightly at the sound of his voice. Ethan cleaned the wound quickly, efficiently, his movements practiced and precise. Years of field work had trained his hands to function without hesitation, even when his mind was somewhere else. He wrapped the bandage tight, securing it in place. "There," he said quietly. "That'll hold." Shadow shifted slightly, testing the pressure, then settled again. The truck slowed as they reached the edge of the forest, the road widening just enough to ease the tension in the drive. No one spoke. Not for a while. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with everything that had just happened. Back at the ranch, the hatch stood open, the bunker below waiting. Ethan carried Shadow down first. The dog could walk, but Ethan didn't give him the chance. He lowered him carefully onto the floor inside, then moved to secure the hatch above. Caleb followed, closing it fully behind them. The lights flickered on as they entered, casting that same muted glow across the concrete walls. But the space felt different now. No longer just a discovery. Now it was a base, a place to work, a place to prepare. Shadow lay near the generator, the low hum of the machine vibrating through the floor beneath him. He rested his head down, but his eyes remained open, tracking Ethan's movements. Ethan knelt beside him, checking the bandage again. Still clean, still holding. "Stay down," Ethan said quietly. Shadow didn't argue. Ethan stood and moved toward the table. Caleb was already there, laying out the photographs Ethan had taken. Labels, company names, shipment codes, pieces. Fragments of something larger. "We got enough?" Ethan asked. Caleb studied the images. "Enough to connect physical inventory to the financial records," he said. "But we still need to tie it all together." Ethan nodded. The drive. Caleb reached for it, plugging it back into the laptop. The screen came alive again, data loading in structured layers. Then, a crack of thunder rolled across the mountain above them. Low. Distant. But inside the bunker, it echoed differently. Ethan's body reacted before he could stop it. His shoulders tightened. His breath caught, just for a second. The sound didn't stay outside. It moved inward, changed shape, turned into something else. Another crack followed, sharper this time, closer. The room flickered for a split second as the lights adjusted. Ethan's hand pressed flat against the table, his eyes fixed on nothing. The bunker disappeared, not physically. But in his mind, dust, heat, Pressure. Distance measured in seconds between impact and silence. Shadow moved. Even injured, he pushed himself up and crossed the short distance between them. He pressed his body against Ethan's leg, firm and steady, grounding him. Not force, not panic. Presence. Ethan closed his eyes, focused. Not on the sound, on the weight, the warmth, the steady rhythm of Shadow's breathing. Here. Now. Another rumble passed overhead, weaker this time. Further away. Ethan exhaled slowly. His shoulders lowered. His hand dropped from the table. "I'm good," he said under his breath. Shadow stayed where he was for a moment longer, then eased back down to the floor, though his eyes remained on Ethan. Watching, making sure. Caleb didn't speak. He had seen enough in the last few hours to understand when silence mattered more than words. The storm moved on. Inside, the bunker returned to its steady hum. Ethan straightened, running a hand through his hair, then looked back at the screen. "Where are we?" he asked. Caleb adjusted the display, pulling up a series of transaction logs. "These are the shell companies," he said. "Each one routes money through the next. On their own, they look legitimate. Together, they hide everything," Ethan finished. Caleb nodded. "But your photos," he tapped one image. "These connect those companies to actual goods. Timber shipments, inventory. That's the missing piece." Ethan leaned in closer. "So we have the flow," he said, "and we have the product. What we don't have," Caleb added, "is time." Ethan looked at him. Caleb pulled up a calendar on the screen. "The deal Arthur mentioned," he said. "It's sooner than we thought." "How much sooner?" Caleb hesitated. 48 hours. The number hung in the air. Ethan processed it quickly. Too fast. Too tight. "We can't build a full case in that time," Caleb continued. "Not through normal channels." Ethan nodded once. "Then we don't use normal channels." Caleb met his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog had settled again, his breathing slower now, the pain controlled, the focus returning. Still in it. Still ready. Ethan turned back to the table. "We don't wait for the system to catch up," he said. "We take it to where it can't be ignored." Caleb understood immediately. "The deal," he said. Ethan nodded. "Wherever he's signing it," he said, "that's where we end it." The bunker went quiet again. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was focused. The kind of silence that comes just before something moves forward. Ethan reached into his pocket. The folded dollar was still there. He pulled it out, looking at it again under the bunker light. $1. A key. A signal. A beginning. He folded it once more and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he looked at Caleb. "Get me everything you can on that deal," he said. "Location, time, people." Caleb nodded. "I'll start now." Ethan turned back to Shadow, crouching beside him again. The dog lifted his head slightly. "You're still with me?" Ethan asked. Shadow's tail moved once. Slow. Certain. Ethan placed a hand gently against his neck. "Good," he said, "because the next part wouldn't be quiet." The bunker lights hummed softly as the screen filled with lines of data, each one representing a piece of a system built to disappear in plain sight. Caleb worked at the laptop, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. He had shed his coat hours ago, Sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. The careful, composed attorney from the conference room had been replaced by someone operating under pressure. Ethan stood behind him, watching. Not the numbers. The patterns. Shadow lay a few feet away, his head resting low, but his eyes still open. The bandage along his shoulder had held, though his movements were slower now, more deliberate. He was conserving energy, but he wasn't out. Not even close. "How long?" Ethan asked. Caleb didn't look up. "Depends," he said. "If everything lines up, we can map the transaction chain in time. And if it doesn't?" Caleb paused. "Then we're walking into that room with half a story." Ethan nodded once. Half a story wasn't enough. Not for something like this. Caleb pulled up a new window, cross-referencing the warehouse photos with the financial logs from the USB drive. Company names began to match. Shipment codes aligned with transaction entries. "Here," Caleb said, pointing. "This company, North Ridge Timber Solutions. It shows up in your photos." Ethan leaned in. "And in the financial records?" Caleb clicked through another layer, he said. "But it's not real. It routes everything to a second entity, which routes again." Ethan straightened. "How many layers?" "Too many," Caleb said quietly. The generator hummed louder for a moment, then settled again. Time passed. Minutes, an hour. The outside world faded completely. Inside there was only the work. Then, Caleb froze. Not completely. Just enough. Ethan saw it immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Caleb's eyes stayed on the screen. "Someone's in the system." Ethan's posture changed instantly. "Define in." Caleb's fingers moved again, faster now. "Unauthorized activity," he said. "Not us. Something else just triggered inside the data structure." Ethan stepped closer. "Can you trace it?" Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not directly. It's buried in the same layers Victor built." The screen flickered. A new process window appeared. Caleb's jaw tightened. "No," he said under his breath. "What?" "They're deleting it." Ethan didn't speak. Caleb pointed. "See this?" he said. "Sequential wipe. Starting from the earliest records and moving forward." Ethan followed the line. Numbers disappearing, entries vanishing. Years of data being erased. "How long?" Ethan asked. Caleb checked the progress indicator. "At this rate, 20 minutes before it hits the endpoint data." "The endpoints are what?" "The proof," Caleb said, "where the money actually ends up. Without that, we have movement, but no destination." Ethan's eyes hardened. "Then we don't wait," he said. Caleb was already moving. "I'm pulling everything I can," he said, downloading in parallel. The system strained. Data flowed in two directions now. One process deleting, one trying to preserve. A race. Shadow lifted his head. The tension in the room had shifted. Ethan moved to his side, resting a hand lightly against his neck. "It's okay," he said quietly. Shadow's ears flicked once. Focused. Present. Back at the table, Caleb worked faster. His breathing changed slightly. Not panic, but pressure. 15 minutes, he said. The screen flashed. Another block of data disappeared. Ethan watched. Didn't interfere. Didn't distract. There was nothing he could do here except hold the line. 10 minutes. The deletion reached deeper into the system. "Come on," Caleb muttered. 8 minutes. The download bar crept forward. Slow, too slow. Ethan glanced at the map on the wall. The deal. 48 hours had already started ticking down. 6 minutes. The endpoint data came into view. Then, started to vanish. Now, Ethan said. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. His fingers moved faster than before, pulling everything that remained. 4 minutes. 3. The screen stuttered. 2 processes collided. The system lagged. Then, the download completed. The progress bar locked. Caleb leaned back slightly, staring at the screen. The deletion continued behind it. But what they needed was already pulled. Silence. Then Ethan spoke. What did we get? Caleb exhaled slowly. 38%, he said. Ethan's expression didn't change. Is it enough? Caleb scanned the files quickly, opening one, then another. His eyes sharpened. Yes, he said. Ethan waited. The endpoints are intact, Caleb continued. The last 2 years of transactions, complete. The earlier ones are gone. Ethan nodded. And Arthur's records? Caleb reached for the handwritten notes from the case. They cover the missing years, he said. Ethan let that settle. 2 halves, different sources. Same story. Together? Ethan asked. Caleb looked up. They're enough, he said. The room shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. The plan hadn't collapsed. It had changed. Ethan stepped back from the table, running a hand across his face. Then we move, he said. Caleb nodded. We don't have a choice. Ethan looked at the clock on the screen. Time was already gone. We need to be in that room before he signs, he said. Caleb closed the laptop halfway, thinking. The deal moved, he said. Victor pushed it forward. It's not 48 hours anymore. Ethan's eyes narrowed. How much? Caleb checked the updated file. 36, he said. Ethan didn't react, but the margin had just gotten thinner. Shadow shifted again, pushing himself up slowly despite the injury. Ethan looked down at him. You don't have to move, he said. Shadow stood anyway. Steady. Ready. Ethan nodded once. Yeah, he said quietly. I figured. He turned back to Caleb. Where's the deal happening? Caleb pulled up the final document. Location, time, details. He read it once, then again. Aspen, he said. Private investor gala. Ethan's expression stayed calm, controlled. That's where we end it, he said. The bunker hummed around them. The storm outside had passed, but something else had started. And now, there was no time left to hesitate. The drive to Aspen cut through a different kind of landscape. Wider valleys, cleaner roads, resorts tucked into the mountains like they belonged there. The kind of place where money didn't announce itself. It simply existed. Ethan sat in the back seat, Shadow beside him, the dog's head resting low, but his eyes alert. The bandage along his shoulder was clean, though the movement beneath it was careful now. Measured. Every shift had purpose. Every step accounted for. Ethan kept one hand resting lightly against Shadow's side. Not checking. Just there. Caleb drove, his focus fixed on the road, though his mind was clearly somewhere else, running through the same calculations over and over. We get one shot at this, he said. Ethan didn't look up. Then we don't miss. The Grand Summit Hotel came into view just before sunset. Glass, timber, stone. Warm light spilling from the windows, cutting through the cold blue of the mountain evening. Cars lined the front drive. Luxury vehicles, polished and silent, their engines barely making a sound as they pulled in and out. People moved in and out of the lobby in tailored coats and formal wear. A different world. Ethan stepped out of the truck. The cold hit him first, then the sound. Muted conversation, soft laughter, music drifting from somewhere inside. Shadow stepped down beside him, adjusting his stance automatically, redistributing his weight to compensate for the injury. It was subtle. Most wouldn't notice. Ethan did. He glanced down. "You good?" he asked quietly. Shadow's ears flicked once. Answer enough. Ethan adjusted his jacket, smoothing it just enough to pass at a glance. Dark slacks, clean shirt, boots that didn't quite match the room but close enough. On his chest, pinned just above the fabric, a small service insignia. Not for show, not for recognition, just a reminder. He didn't need to borrow authority from this place. He already had his own. Inside, the lobby opened wide and warm. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne. Conversations layered over each other in controlled tones, people speaking in measured voices that never quite rose above a certain level. Eyes turned. Not as sharply as before, but still enough. Ethan walked through it without slowing. Shadow moved beside him, his harness clean and fitted, the working dog patch visible on both sides. Anyone who knew what they were looking at would understand immediately. This was not a pet. This was purpose. The ballroom doors stood open ahead. Inside, light, sound, movement. A room full of people who believed they were safe. Ethan stepped in. The scale of it hit first. Hundreds of people, investors, executives, board members, all gathered beneath soft lighting and high ceilings, glasses in hand, conversations flowing easily. At the far end, a stage. And on that stage, Victor Bennett. Not speaking yet, but preparing. Ethan saw him immediately. The posture, the confidence, the ease of a man who believed everything was under control. Victor turned slightly, speaking with a group near the center of the room. Then, his eyes found Ethan. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden reaction. Just a pause. A fraction of a second longer than normal. Then recognition. Victor excused himself from the group and began walking toward him. Unhurried, controlled, like nothing had changed. Shadow shifted slightly in front of Ethan. Not aggressive. Positioning. Victor stopped a few feet away. He looked at the dog first, then at Ethan. A small smile touched his face. "You brought the dog," he said. Not a question. Ethan met his gaze. "He goes where I go." Victor's smile didn't change. "I heard about the warehouse," he said quietly. "That was bold." Ethan didn't respond. Victor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You should have stayed out of it," he said. Ethan's expression stayed level. "You should have done the same," he replied. For a moment, something flickered behind Victor's eyes. Not anger. Calculation. Then it was gone. Victor straightened. "You're in over your head," he said. Whatever you think you found, Ethan cut him off. Funny thing about secrets, he said calmly. They don't stay buried. Victor held his gaze for a second longer. Then he smiled again. Polished, controlled. Enjoy the show, he said. He turned and walked back toward the stage. Shadow remained still, watching. Ethan moved to the side of the room, positioning himself where he could see everything. The stage, the exits, the people who mattered. Caleb appeared a few moments later, blending into the edge of the crowd. Everything's ready, he said under his breath. Ethan nodded once. Timing? He asked. Caleb glanced toward the stage. Soon. The room began to shift. Subtly at first. Conversations slowed. Attention redirected. The event was starting. A host stepped onto the stage, offering a welcome, his voice smooth and practiced. Applause followed, polite and expected. Then Victor was introduced. He stepped forward, taking the microphone with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. The room quieted. Victor began to speak. About the company, about legacy, about growth. His voice carried confidence, every word placed carefully, designed to build trust, to reinforce authority. Ethan listened, not to the words, to the timing, to the rhythm. Waiting. Victor moved toward the announcement. The deal. The moment everything would become official. Shadow's ears lifted. Both of them. At the same time. Ethan saw it, felt it. Now. He raised his hand slightly, just enough for Caleb to see. Caleb moved. At the back of the room, a technician hesitated as the system flickered. Then, the screens behind Victor changed. Mid-sentence, the presentation cut, replaced. Numbers, transactions, company names, clear, undeniable. A timeline stretched across the display. Years of movement, money flowing through entities that shouldn't exist. The room froze. Victor turned. His words stopped. The color drained slightly from his face. Not dramatically, but enough. He saw it. Understood it. Immediately. This is fabricated, he said into the microphone. His voice remained controlled, but the effort behind it was new. Someone has manipulated. More data appeared. Warehouse images, shipping labels, connections. The room erupted. Not all at once, but in waves, voices rising, questions, movement, phones coming out, recording, capturing. Victor stepped away from the microphone. His control was slipping, not gone, but weakening. He moved off the stage, toward Ethan. Faster this time. The crowd parted around him, uncertainty replacing confidence. Shadow stepped forward one pace, positioned. Victor stopped. Just outside that line, his eyes locked onto Ethan's. You think this ends here? He said quietly. Ethan didn't raise his voice. It already did. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, from the main doors, 3 figures entered. Dark suits, federal identification visible. They didn't rush. Didn't need to. The room shifted again. Recognition. Authority. Victor saw them. Everything changed. Not in a flash, but in the slow, controlled collapse of someone who understands exactly what is happening. A man appeared at Victor's side, his lawyer. Quick words exchanged. Low. Urgent. Victor's shoulders lowered slightly. Not defeat. Acceptance. The agents approached. Calm. Measured. Victor didn't resist. Didn't argue. He simply stepped away with them, leaving the center of the room empty behind him. The noise continued. But the outcome was already decided. Ethan stood where he was. Still. Shadow returned to his side. The room around them no longer mattered. The mission was complete. But the room hadn't caught up yet. Voices overlapped in rising waves. Questions, disbelief, fragments of conversation that didn't connect but didn't need to. Phones were still raised, capturing what had just happened, turning it into something that would move beyond this room within minutes. Ethan didn't move. He stood where he was, one hand resting lightly along Shadow's back, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm. Alive. Present. Still with him, huh? Across the room, Victor Bennett was no longer the center of attention. He was being escorted. Not dragged, not forced, just guided. By two federal agents who didn't raise their voices, didn't need to. Their authority didn't come from volume. It came from certainty. Victor walked between them. His posture was still upright, controlled. But something had shifted, not in his body, in his eyes. The confidence was gone, replaced by calculation that no longer had anywhere to go. His lawyer stayed close, speaking quietly into his ear, words too low to hear, but urgent enough to matter. Victor didn't look back. Not at the stage, not at the screens, and not at Ethan. That was how Ethan knew. It was over. Caleb approached from the side, his expression tighter than before but carrying something else beneath it. Release. They've opened the case, he said. Federal jurisdiction. Ethan nodded once. Company? He asked. Caleb exhaled. They'll restructure, he said. Board intervention, oversight. It'll take time, but it won't collapse. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He looked around the room. At the people. At the investors who had come expecting a deal and were now standing in small, uncertain groups. At the executives whose faces had gone pale as the numbers on the screen had added up to something they couldn't ignore. At the staff moving along the edges, unsure whether to continue, to intervene, or to disappear. Arthur had been right. This was the only place it could have happened. Out in the open, where no one could bury it again. Shadow shifted slightly beside him, adjusting his weight. The movement was small, but Ethan felt it. He glanced down. The dog's breathing had slowed. The tension had eased, but the injury was still there. A reminder. Ethan reached down briefly, brushing his hand against the side of Shadow's neck. Good work, he said quietly. Shadow's tail moved once, then stilled. A woman's voice spoke from his left. You're Ethan. Ethan turned. She stood a few feet away, composed, steady in a way that didn't match the chaos around her. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, eyes that didn't avoid anything. Claire Bennett, Victor's sister. Ethan recognized her from the file. She had been in the room earlier, silent, observing. Now she stepped closer. Her gaze flicked briefly to Shadow, then back to Ethan. He told me about you, she said. Ethan didn't ask who. He already knew. Claire's eyes moved across the room, toward the exit where Victor had disappeared, then back again. He thought you'd be the only one who wouldn't take advantage of it, she said. Ethan studied her. And you? He asked. Claire held his gaze. I wasn't sure, she said. Not until tonight. There was no accusation in it, no judgment, just fact. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document, held it out to him. Ethan didn't take it immediately. What is it? He asked. Something my brother didn't think anyone else would find, she said. Ethan took it, unfolded it. The paper was official, structured, precise. His eyes moved across the lines, then slowed. The agreement outlined a private arrangement, 2 years old, between Victor and the primary investor standing in this very room minutes ago. It detailed the method, the integration, the final step that would have buried everything. This wasn't part of the drive, wasn't part of the warehouse. This was the missing piece, the confirmation. Ethan looked up. Why give me this now? He asked. Claire's expression didn't change. Because now I know you won't use it the wrong way, she said. Ethan held her gaze. There was more behind that. Something quieter, something harder. You could have stopped him earlier, Ethan said. Claire didn't flinch. I could have tried, she said. It wouldn't have worked. She glanced once more toward the door. He built everything to protect himself, she continued, except this. She nodded toward the document. He didn't think I'd keep it. Ethan folded the paper carefully, added it to the inside of his jacket. Claire stepped back. Her eyes moved once more to Shadow, then to Ethan. He trusted you, she said. Ethan didn't answer. Claire gave a small nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the thinning crowd. No hesitation. No need to stay. Caleb exhaled slowly. That just made everything airtight, he said. Ethan nodded. Yeah. The screens behind the stage flickered again, then went dark as someone finally cut the feed. Too late. It had already spread. Ethan reached into his pocket. The folded dollar was still there. He pulled it out, holding it between his fingers. Under the ballroom lights, it looked the same as it had that morning. Worn, ordinary, small. But now, it meant something different. He placed it on the table beside him. For a moment, he just looked at it. Then he folded it again along the same line and slipped it back into his pocket. Caleb's phone buzzed. He checked it quickly. They've confirmed, he said. Trust is intact. Conditions met. Ethan let out a slow breath. Not relief, not exactly. More like something settling into place. Good, he said. Around them, the room continued to empty. People leaving, talking, processing. But for Ethan, the noise didn't matter anymore. He looked down at Shadow. The dog met his eyes, still steady, still there. Ethan rested his hand on his head. We're done, he said quietly. Shadow didn't move. Didn't need to. Because for the first time since this had started, there was nothing left to chase. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was unfamiliar. Ethan stood in the ballroom as the last of the crowd filtered out, the polished floors reflecting the fading light, the hum of voices now distant, dissolving into the corridors beyond. The stage was empty. The screens dark. What had been a moment of exposure just minutes ago was already becoming memory, but not the kind that disappears, the kind that changes things. Caleb placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. I'll handle the rest with the federal team, he said. You don't need to stay. Ethan nodded. Appreciate it. Caleb hesitated for a second, then added, "He chose right." Ethan didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Caleb left without another word. Ethan remained for a moment longer, then turned toward the exit. Shadow moved with him, steady, controlled, the slight hitch in his stride still there but no longer defining him. They stepped outside. The night air was colder now. Cleaner. The mountains stood silent in the distance, dark shapes against a sky that had cleared completely. No storm, no pressure. Just stillness. Ethan exhaled slowly. For the first time in days, his breathing matched the rhythm of the world around him. No urgency. No countdown. No next move. Just quiet. Shadow stepped forward, then paused, looking back at him. Waiting. Ethan gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." Spring didn't arrive all at once in the Bitterroot Valley. It never did. It came in stages. First the thaw, snow breaking into patches, water carving narrow lines through frozen ground. Then the mud. Then, slowly, green. Ethan stood at the edge of the property, hands resting on the top rail of a newly built fence. The ranch had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that erased what it had been. But enough. The house had been repaired, its structure straightened, the roof reinforced against the weight of future winters. The barn stood solid again. And beneath it, the bunker remained. Not hidden anymore. Not forgotten. Repurposed. Used. A place that had once held secrets now held something else entirely. Purpose. Behind him, the sound of movement carried across the open field. Voices. Low. Focused. A small group of veterans worked near the far end of the property, each paired with a dog. Not trained yet. Not disciplined. Learning. Ethan watched as one of them, a younger man, maybe early 30s, struggled to keep pace with a restless German shepherd pulling slightly ahead. Frustration flickered in the man's posture. Uncertainty. Then, Shadow moved. He crossed the field at a steady trot, not fast, not aggressive. Just present. He circled wide around the pair, adjusting his pace, his movement creating a rhythm. The younger dog noticed. Adjusted. Matched. The man felt it. His grip steadied. His steps aligned. For a moment, it worked. A small laugh broke from him. Unexpected, uncontrolled, but real. Ethan watched from the fence. Didn't interfere. Didn't instruct. He didn't need to. Shadow returned a few moments later, slowing as he approached, then settling beside Ethan, his body lowering into the grass with a quiet exhale. The scar along his shoulder was visible now, the fur grown back thinner, the line clean but permanent. A reminder. Ethan reached down, resting his hand lightly against the spot. Shadow didn't react. Didn't need to. They both knew it was there. They both knew what it meant. The company had survived, not untouched, not unchanged, but intact. The board had restructured, new oversight, new leadership. Thousands of jobs still in place. That had been the point. Arthur had never wanted destruction. He had wanted correction. Ethan understood that now. The trust had been released months ago. $50 million. It hadn't felt real at first. Still didn't, in some ways. But it wasn't sitting in an account. It was here. In the land. In the buildings. In the people learning to stand steady again. Ethan hadn't built something new. He had continued something that had already been set in motion. He had just finished it. He turned toward the house. Inside, the air carried the smell of wood and coffee. Simple. Warm. On the far wall, above the fireplace, a frame, plain, dark wood. Inside it, a single dollar bill. Folded once along the same line it had carried from the beginning. Under glass. Unchanged. But not the same. Ethan stepped closer, looking at it. For a moment the memory returned. The conference room. The silence. The quiet laughter. The weight of something that had seemed like nothing. He studied the bill. Then the room around him. Then the field outside. Some inheritances didn't come as gifts. They came as responsibility. As trust. As something that had to be earned long after it was given. Ethan turned away from the wall. Shadow followed. Always. Outside, the wind moved gently across the grass, carrying the scent of pine and earth waking up after a long winter. The mountains stood in the distance, unchanged. Steady. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. Paused. Then moved forward. Not toward a mission. Not toward a fight. But toward something quieter. Something lasting. Shadow stayed at his side. Not leading. Not following. Just there. Exactly where he was supposed to be. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. If you believe loyalty should be honored and the truth always finds its way out, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0. And if stories like this mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe, because there are more real stories about justice, land, and standing your ground coming your way.